Hello and welcome to Euronews Tonight. Here are our top stories. A new European security pact and dialogue with Russia. Emmanuel Macron outlines France's policy priorities while it holds the EU presidency. United we stand. US Secretary of State reassures Ukraine of unwavering Western support amid growing fears of an imminent Russian invasion.
In the name of God, go.
Boris Johnson faces calls from within his own party to resign as the so-called Partygate scandal continues to pile pressure on the British Prime Minister.
And here in the Cube, we look at the security concerns raised about the app that will be used by athletes at the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics.
Welcome to the program. I'm Stefan Grober. President Emmanuel Macron has laid out his vision for the EU in his first speech to MEPs since France took over the presidency of the bloc on January the 1st. With escalating tensions between Ukraine and Russia amid fears of a Russian invasion, Macron urged the EU to arm itself in order to defend its interests. He says the EU should hold what he called frank dialogue with Moscow and seek a political solution to the ongoing crisis. Brussels was excluded from recent US-Russia talks. Macron says a more security-focused bloc would give them a seat at the negotiating table.
These next few weeks must lead to a European proposal to build a new security and stability pact. We must build it between Europeans before we share it with our allies within NATO and then offer it up for negotiation with Russia.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in the Ukrainian capital Kiev earlier for talks on the country's security concerns. Blinken came bearing messages of unity from President Joe Biden in the face of Russian aggression. He says Russia's troop buildup along Ukraine's border is a clear threat, and any invasion by Moscow will result in severe consequences. President Zelensky thanked the US for its support and for helping modernize its armed forces.
There are some 100,000 Russian soldiers near Ukraine's borders, and in that sense, the threat to Ukraine is unprecedented. So the President asked me to underscore once again our commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, to its sovereignty, to its independence. So our message to all of our friends here, to all of Ukraine's political leaders, to its citizens alike, is to stick together and to hold on to that unity, to strengthen it. It's never been more important, particularly as the country faces the possibility of renewed Russian aggression.
This support not only speaks to our strategic plans of Ukraine joining NATO, but more importantly to the level of our military and military supplies. Yes, we allocate the largest amounts in the budget for our military, but we still understand that if we want dramatically faster steps in modernising the military, we need help, especially in these tough times.
Let's bring in our correspondent Grégoire Lurie, who is at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Good evening, Greg. Good to see you. So, with the Russians at the gate of Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron is asking for a new strategic rearmament of Europe. How did that resonate with MEPs?
Well, Stefan, you can imagine MEPs have followed very closely the statement by Emmanuel Macron. I'm joined here today with David McAllister, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee from the EPP. Mr. McAllister, what was your reaction to Emmanuel Macron saying that Europe should prepare for strategic rearmament?
Well, I was in the plenary today here in Strasbourg witnessing what the French president had to say, and President Macron outlined the priorities of the French presidency for this first half of 2022, and I welcome that one of the top priorities of the French presidency is to move forward on European foreign policy, but also on security and defence. And for instance, the summit in March in Paris on EU defence policy will be an important step forward. And I do hope that under the French presidency, the strategic compass can be adopted so that we kind of have a white book, a roadmap, how to make concrete steps towards a European defence union.
What's the position of the European Parliament on defence issues?
For many years, the European Parliament has been calling for a more active and a strengthened common foreign and security policy and a common security and defence policy. The European Union is a global payer. And the European Union has shown, for instance, when it comes to trade, how strong we are when we get our act together. But we are a soft power, and that is good. We are proud of being a soft power, but we also need hard power capabilities. That's why we need to move on in creating a European defence union. We need much closer cooperation on foreign affairs and especially on security and defence. But one thing is important for me to underline: NATO is the cornerstone of European security, and all our activities should not be doubling NATO capabilities or being in competition with NATO. It's about strengthening the European pillar within the NATO framework. So perhaps you can sum it up in saying we want to remain transatlantic, we want to stay transatlantic, but on the other hand, we want to become increasingly also European.
Is France got some allies on this strategic autonomy that Paris is claiming for?
I think there's a consensus among the 27 EU member states that we have to move on, if you want to call it strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. What all these terms have in common is that Europe needs to strengthen its capability to act. And the developments in 2021 were once again a wake-up call. We have to do more for our own security and defense, in close cooperation with our transatlantic partners, with the United States of America, Canada, and the United Kingdom.
Emmanuel Macron has targeted Russia in particular. This is the major threat for the EU?
Well, what we're seeing in the moment is the biggest threat to European security in decades. We as a European Union want to have good relations with Russia, but in the moment they are extremely challenged, and Moscow is responsible for this. We want to see our cooperation with Russia based on the fundamental principles of European security architecture. That means the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, to respect the territorial sovereignty and integrity of all European countries. We are in favor of good neighbourly relations and a good rules-based cooperation respecting international law. The Kremlin and President Putin is questioning this, and that's why we are in favor of continued dialogue and diplomacy with Russia. But on the other hand, we have to be very clear that we stand in solidarity with Ukraine, that we cannot accept bullying or even the threatening of a military aggression against a sovereign country. And President Putin needs to know that a military aggression against Ukraine would have enormous economic consequences for Moscow.
Well, thank you very much, David McAllister. That was the position from what we could hear from the European Parliament after Emmanuel Macron's statement on security issues.
All right, thank you very much, Grégoire Laurie at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. To go deeper on this, I'm now joined by Orysia Lutsevich, head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House in London. Good evening and thanks for coming on the show. So, Blinken again pledged more military assistance to Ukraine. To what extent will that enable Ukraine to withstand a Russian aggression?
I think Secretary Blinken and President Zelensky clearly underscored the need to build Ukraine's resilience to Russian encroachment and full spectrum warfare that the Kremlin is unveiling in Ukraine. And obviously, any new military assistance that will build Ukraine's defensive capabilities will inflict more cost on Russia and hopefully will make Kremlin think twice about further incursion into new Ukrainian territory or even malicious cyber strikes, cyber attacks like we have seen this time. So this assistance is critical and time is short. So United States has to walk the talk and support Ukraine as much as it can to defend itself.
Well, at the end of the day, Western support will boil down to this. Who among NATO countries is willing and prepared to send boots on the ground to Ukraine?
Well, Stefan, I think you're right that it will be a coalition of the willing. Of course, it is key that the Western allies preserve transatlantic unity, and countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, eastern neighbors of eastern bloc of NATO member states, such as Poland, Baltic states, they definitely have more resolve to get more actively involved in deterring Russia from Ukraine. And some countries, such as Germany and possibly France, are more shy about it. That is why I think it's important that part of the French presidency is this genuine dialogue. What European member states are willing to contribute, and there could be a variety of contributions. But the question is, do they perceive Russia as a threat to a similar extent as Poland compared to Portugal or even France? So it's an important internal dialogue that is tested right now in Ukraine with Russian likelihood of military aggression.
All right, Orysia Lutsevich, thank you so much from Chatham House, of course. Thanks for being on the show. Boris Johnson faced another grueling Prime Minister's questions as he tried to defend his position and deflect calls for his resignation, as the scandal over the so-called Partygate sees him fighting for his political life. More of those calls are now coming from within his own Conservative Party, and one of his own MPs has defected to the opposition Labour Party. The Prime Minister was put under intense pressure again from Labour leader Keir Starmer, who said Johnson was trying to defend the indefensible.
It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Central to the main line of defence for Boris Johnson over the party held on May 20th is that he didn't know it was a party. He also claims to not have been aware of any concerns his staff had over the holding of it, something that's been directly disputed by at least two people. Keir Starmer pushed him to tell Parliament what he knew and when.
I'm grateful to Right Honourable Johnson for repeating the question that he's already asked. We have answered, Mr. Speaker, that it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed.
A lot to unpack here. Let's go to our reporter Tyke Enright in London. Good evening, Tyke. So we had a major Tory figure calling on Johnson to just go, another Tory defecting to Labour. Is Johnson's ship starting to sink?
Hi, Stefan. Well, yes, the ship Boris Johnson sprung a leak before Christmas when the revelations of these parties started to emerge, and there's been a list of damaging leaks to journalists about other parties ever since. And yes, I think where we are right now, there is every chance that Johnson could go under, not just because of the holding of these parties during lockdown when we were supposed to be staying at home and staying away from other people, but also because of the apparent lies that he's told in seeking to cover them up. Last month he told Parliament that there were no parties and no rules were broken. Now we know that there were indeed parties and that indeed Boris Johnson went to one of them. So after a pretty disastrous TV interview on Tuesday, a group of relatively recently elected MPs within the Conservative Party started to coordinate their moves against him. And yes, you mentioned there that political bomb that went off around the time of Prime Minister's questions, with one of the Conservative MPs defecting to the Labour Party and a party grandee telling him, for the love of God, just go. So there is a process in train. MPs who want him gone have been writing letters of no confidence to an internal Conservative Party committee. It is a secret secret process, but several MPs have publicly declared that they've written such letters, and we know that other MPs have been doing likewise. There's a magic number of 54 such letters have to be written before you trigger this process, at which point there will be a formal vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson. If he loses that, he's gone. But if he actually gets through that, then he can't face that process again. He's immune from that process for a further 12 months. So those who do want him to go will have to be careful, have to be strategic in the timing of when they trigger that process. Do they do it now? Do they wait for that report by the civil servant Sue Gray to ascertain whether indeed these parties were illegal or not? All the while, Boris Johnson is trying to move the narrative on by also announcing today that most COVID restrictions, the same type of restrictions he's accused of breaking, are being lifted.
Yeah, so if Boris Johnson is forced out, who is waiting in the wings to replace him?
Well, speculation is centering mainly on two figures. The current finance minister, Rishi Sunak, he's a very slick operator. His ambitions are clear to see for the top job, and who's been pretty lukewarm in his support for Boris Johnson when he's been speaking about it in recent days. Also, the foreign minister, Liz Truss, she's clearly been on manoeuvres for the top job for some time as well. Both those figures, though, are, of course, within the cabinet, and they're not openly running at this stage. One, though, who has tentatively thrown his hat in the ring, or certainly said that he might run, is Jeremy Hunt, former health minister who came second in the last leadership race to Boris Johnson. He said he could be convinced to run again. He's a much more moderate force, but you know, the party does remain quite divided along kind of Brexit, Leave Remain lines between moderates and those on the right-hand side of the party. And I think at this stage you couldn't say that there would be any clear favourite to succeed Boris Johnson, and that perhaps is part of the reason which is holding some MPs back from actually starting this process. Stefan?
All right, Tyke Enright there in London, as always. Thank you very much. Just over 2 weeks before the Beijing Winter Olympics begin, fresh concerns have been raised over athlete security. A data watchdog says it's identified serious flaws in an app that will be used by participants at the upcoming Games. But the International Olympic Committee has played down the report. Matthew in the Cube has more.
Well, Stefan, My 2022 is the app that is going to be widely available for athletes and journalists at the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics. This is what the app looks like, and it predominantly serves to protect China and prevent any outbreaks of the virus during the COVID-19 pandemic. People who are participating in the Games have been encouraged to download this app 2 weeks before they travel. And this means entering sensitive health information, not just their passport number, but also their vaccination status and, of course, their country of origin. And this week, there have been fresh concerns about athletes' data privacy and potential surveillance at the upcoming Games. The Canadian research group known as Citizen Lab have published a report saying that they have identified several security flaws within the My 2022 app. They said that the data of athletes could be accessed by hackers, and also that when athletes go to, for example, Beijing hotels, Olympic venues or airports and use the Wi-Fi there, then their information might also be available to the companies that provide an internet service. Citizen Lab also said that they have identified some political topics that have been censored from discussion within the app's chat rooms. Now, this report has been responded to by the International Olympic Committee. They have dismissed these allegations. They say that they have had 2 independent cybersecurity firms examine My 2022 and that neither of them have found any critical vulnerabilities. The International Olympic Committee have also said that athletes are not going to have to download this app, and also that it is there to protect their health during the upcoming Games. But on the top of this, you have a number of countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany and the Netherlands who have all reportedly told their athletes not to take their normal phones to Beijing, but instead to take temporary phones that don't store their personal data. Other countries, of course, have taken part in a diplomatic boycott of the Games over China's alleged human rights breaches. And on top of this all, Stefan, you have other human rights organisations warning athletes not to speak up and raise awareness for any issues, either online or offline, that go beyond the rules of the International Olympic Committee.
Aid from neighboring Australia and New Zealand is on its way to the devastated Pacific island nation of Tonga. Water supplies, shelter, and the repair of critical infrastructure are top priorities as the islands try to recover following Saturday's tsunami. Images show a blanket of volcanic ash across large areas where buildings and roads have been destroyed. At least 3 people are known to have been killed. Heather Donald reports.
Tonga is evacuating at least 150 residents from its islands that were most affected by the volcanic eruption and following tsunami. They will be moved to some of the less impacted islands. The tsunami waves have caused serious damage to many of the islands, and ash has covered the general area.
Communications, both national and international, have been severed due to damage sustained by the submarine cables. The internet remains down as of this morning, and only as of yesterday, some slight communication was established with some of the outer islands through satellite phones and HF radios.
New Zealand has so far sent 2 Navy ships to help with aid efforts, and it has pledged around €600,000 towards recovery relief.
For the people of Tonga, we're heading their way now with a whole lot of water. The ship can currently holds over 250,000 litres of water, and we'll be able to provide that once we arrive.
There have been 3 reported fatalities so far and multiple injuries. The 15-metre waves have destroyed homes, businesses and an entire village.
Most COVID-19 restrictions in England will be lifted from next week. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says people will no longer have to wear masks in closed spaces, work home, or prove they've been vaccinated in order to enter public spaces. The move follows a reduction of daily coronavirus infections. Germany has reached 100,000 new daily cases of COVID-19 for the first time. Queues of people have been growing outside testing centers, with waiting times up to more than an hour. Health Minister Karl Lauterbach has again called for vaccinations to be made mandatory. That's it for this edition. Thank you for watching and goodbye.